We got another crash out, man.
I'm so tired of it. It just makes no sense to me, and I'm tired that we keep giving it so much energy.
This is crazy, man. We have to revisit a crash out.
And I'm tired of it being people who are not in this circle or space at all, who suddenly have all these opinions about how these women need to treat Caitlin Clark.
You are right. You are right, new fans.
What do you want from them? They want to beat her because she's not on their team.
We talked about that earlier in our pod today. You actually were quoted somewhere saying this is the first time you have zero fear around the league folding.
Isn't that how it's supposed to be? Y'all stop it. We already know she's transformational. They've all said it. How many times do they gotta say it?
It didn't feel like a big moment when it happened. Just another sports media take, another debate segment, another opinion that would normally disappear into the timeline by the next news cycle. But this one didn't. Because months later, that clip is still being replayed. And now, it's agging in a way nobody expected. At the height of the biggest surge the WNBA has seen in decades, Elle Duncan went on ESPN and made a claim that stunned a lot of people watching. She argued that the wave of new fans flooding into the league because of Caitlin Clark wasn't helping the WNBA. She said it was draining it, sucking the life out of it. At the time, some brushed it off as frustration. Others saw it as gatekeeping, but very few thought it would come back around like this. Because fast forward to now, and the league feels different. The energy has cooled, viewership has dipped, labor tension is dominating headlines, and for the first time in a long time, public opinion feels split in a way that's uncomfortable for a league that was just celebrating unprecedented momentum. Even respected voices inside the game are stepping in, warning that something went wrong. That's where this story really starts. This isn't just about one media comment, it's about a mindset, a tone, and a moment where growth may have been treated like a problem instead of an opportunity. Last season, the WNBA had everything it had spent years asking for: packed arenas, national debates, merchandise flying off shelves, major networks giving women's basketball real airtime instead of filler segments. And at the center of it all was Caitlin Clark, the entry point for millions of new viewers. And yet, instead of welcoming that audience, parts of the conversation turned hostile. New fans were questioned. Their motives were dissected. Their presence was framed as disruptive rather than necessary. Now, as the league stares down labor disputes and declining enthusiasm, that attitude is being re-examined. Hall of Famer Rebecca Lobo has openly warned that fans are being pushed away instead of brought in, and that warning carries weight. So here's the real question. Did the WNBA accidentally sabotage its own momentum? Did media voices and internal messaging turn the league's biggest breakthrough into a missed opportunity? And do Caitlin Clark and the fans who showed up because of her deserve an apology? Because what we are watching now doesn't just look like a slowdown. It looks like the consequences of a moment that was completely mishandled. And the fallout is just getting started. To understand why that comment hit such a nerve, you have to go back to when it was said. This wasn't a slow season. This wasn't a quiet rebuild year. This was peak momentum. The WNBA was riding a wave it had never experienced at this scale, and Caitlin Clark was at the center of it. Arenas were selling out weeks in advance. Road games suddenly felt like home games for the visiting team. Television numbers were breaking internal records. Even casual sports fans, people who had never watched a full WNBA game before, were tuning in. That's the backdrop. So when Elle Duncan went on ESPN and suggested that these new fans were sucking the life out of the league, it didn't just sound harsh. It sounded disconnected from reality. Because from the outside, this looked like success. Major sports shows were running extended segments on women's basketball. Social media engagement was exploding. Merchandise sales were surging. For the first time in years, the league wasn't fighting for attention, it had it. And not because of a manufactured push, but because people genuinely wanted to watch. That's why the timing made the comment so jarring. Instead of celebrating the moment, the message felt defensive, as if the attention came with a problem attached, as if growth itself needed to be monitored or managed instead of embraced. And while Duncan wasn't the only person expressing that sentiment, she became the face of it because the clip traveled so far. Fans heard it loud and clear. New viewers, many of whom were showing up in good faith, felt unwelcome almost immediately. Instead of being pulled deeper into the league, they were told, indirectly, that they were watching for the wrong reasons, that they didn't understand the culture, that their interest came with conditions. And that's a dangerous tone to strike when your product is finally breaking through. What made things worse was how obvious the contradiction felt. Networks don't suddenly devote long segments to something unless there's demand. Ratings don't spike by accident. Coverage doesn't grow out of charity. It grows because people are watching. Yet in that moment, attention was framed as a threat instead of a signal. And once that idea entered the conversation, it spread quickly. Not as an official stance, but as an attitude, one that suggested the league wanted growth, but only on its own terms. New fans were welcome, but only if they blended in quietly, only if they didn't change the dynamics, only if they didn't shift the spotlight too much toward one star. That underlying tension didn't explode immediately, but it lingered. And as the season went on, that mindset would quietly shape the way fans, media, and even players interacted with the moment, setting the stage for everything that unraveled afterward. Because what happened next wasn't random. It was the natural result of treating momentum like something suspicious instead of something fragile. What made this moment even more unsettling is that the comment didn't exist in a vacuum. Once the door was opened, a broader sentiment started creeping into the conversation, one that went beyond a single ESPN segment. Across social media, podcasts, and post-game interviews, a pattern began to emerge. New fans weren't just being questioned, they were being judged. Instead of asking how to bring people in, the discussion shifted toward who deserved to be there. Longtime followers of the league pushed back against the sudden attention. Some argued that newcomers didn't understand the history. Others suggested they were only watching for the wrong reasons. And at the center of it all was Caitlin Clark, whose presence had clearly altered the balance of attention. The uncomfortable truth is this: the league didn't just gain fans, it gained a new entry point. Clark became the reason millions tuned in for the first time. That doesn't erase the talent already in the league, but it does change how attention flows. And for some voices, that shift felt threatening. Instead of seeing Clark as a bridge to broader popularity, she was treated like a disruption to an ecosystem that preferred gradual, controlled growth. That's where resentment quietly took root. Fans noticed it. They felt it in the tone of conversations, in the way Clark's performances were dissected differently, in how often her popularity was framed as a problem that needed explaining, rather than a breakthrough worth protecting. Even neutral viewers began to sense tension, an undercurrent suggesting that being too popular, too fast, was somehow inappropriate. And that's not how sports fandom works. Every major league has grown on the back of star power. The NBA didn't become global without names people could latch onto. The same goes for every successful sports brand in the world. Attention doesn't spread evenly. It follows moments, personalities, and players who pull people in emotionally. Yet instead of acknowledging that reality, parts of the WNBA conversation resisted it. Success was treated with suspicion. Growth was framed as conditional, and fans, especially new ones, were subtly told they needed to earn their place before being welcomed fully. That kind of messaging doesn't explode overnight. It wears people down slowly. Because fans don't want to feel like guests in a space they're supporting. They don't want to be tested. They don't want to be lectured. They want to enjoy the game, connect with players, and feel like their interest matters. And once that feeling slips, even slightly, it's hard to get back. That's when momentum starts to wobble. And it's exactly why the conversation was about to shift. from excitement to frustration, from growth to damage control. Because the league didn't just risk alienating new fans. It risked misunderstanding how attention actually works in modern sports. And that misunderstanding would soon show up in the numbers. That misunderstanding becomes obvious the moment you look at how sports media actually operates. Coverage doesn't lead interest, it follows it. Networks don't wake up one day and decide to dedicate long segments to a league out of goodwill. They do it because audiences show up. Ratings dictate airtime. Engagement dictates conversation. That's not bias, it's the basic economics of sports media. And that's where the disconnect grew wider. Before Caitlin Clark entered the picture, the WNBA struggled for consistent mainstream coverage. Not because the basketball wasn't good, but because the audience wasn't large enough to justify sustained attention. Games happened, great performances happened, but they didn't break through on a national level in a way that moved numbers. Then Clark arrived, and everything changed. Suddenly, shows like First Take were spending real time on women's basketball. Debate segments weren't rushed. Highlights weren't buried. Road games felt like events. And that shift didn't happen because producers suddenly changed their values. It happened because people were watching in real time. That's the part some voices ignored. Instead of recognizing Clark as the catalyst that finally aligned performance with demand, her visibility was treated like an imbalance, as if attention being concentrated around one player was unfair or somehow harmful to the league as a whole. But concentration is how sports grow. Every league has had a moment like this. One player, one rivalry, one storyline that pulls in a massive audience and creates room for everything else to expand. That's not exploitation, it's momentum. And momentum, once established, is incredibly fragile. The danger isn't star power. The danger is refusing to protect it. When the conversation shifted toward questioning why people were watching instead of appreciating that they were watching at all, the message landed poorly. Fans heard skepticism where they expected celebration. They heard defensiveness where they expected confidence. And slowly, the tone changed. Instead of excitement, there was tension. Instead of curiosity, there was correction. Instead of leaning into the spotlight, parts of the conversation tried to dim it, worried that the light wasn't being distributed evenly enough. But audiences don't think that way. Fans don't arrive with spreadsheets. They arrive through emotion, through connection, through a reason to care. And once they're in, the ecosystem grows naturally, other players get discovered, other teams get attention, other storylines take off. That process had finally started. And instead of letting it breathe, it was questioned in public. That's why this moment matters so much in hindsight, because it wasn't just a bad take. It was a misunderstanding of how growth actually happens. And when you misunderstand growth, you risk pushing it away. Which is exactly what the next phase of this story begins to show, when the numbers start talking back. That's when the numbers started telling a different story. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly enough that it was easy to miss until it was. As the season moved forward and the initial Caitlin Clark surge settled, signs of cooling began to appear. Viewership that had reached historic highs started slipping back. Social media engagement softened. The non-stop national conversations faded. And the casual fans, the ones who had shown up out of curiosity and stayed because the games felt electric, began drifting away just as quietly as they arrived. That's when reality set in. Momentum in sports is fragile. It's not permanent. It has to be protected, reinforced, and nurtured. And once it starts leaking, getting it back is far harder than building it in the first place. What made this decline especially frustrating is that it didn't come from a lack of talent or effort on the court. The basketball was still good. The competition was still intense, but the feeling around the league had changed. The tone wasn't welcoming anymore, it was defensive. Fans noticed. Many of the same people who had bought tickets, followed teams, and engaged online during the peak suddenly felt blamed for caring the wrong way. Instead of being treated like new supporters, they felt like outsiders who needed to justify their presence. And when fandom starts feeling like a test, people opt out. That's not speculation, that's behavior. Sports thrive when fans feel wanted. They fade when fans feel tolerated. This is also where labor tension entered the picture, making everything heavier. Negotiations that might have been framed as progress instead felt combative in public. Language hardened, messaging grew sharper, and instead of uniting players and fans around shared growth, it created distance. That's when respected voices inside the game stepped in. Rebecca Lobo began openly warning that the league was pushing fans away instead of bringing them closer. And that mattered because Lobo isn't a hot take artist. She's a Hall of Famer with deep roots in the league, someone who understands both where the WNBA came from and how fragile this moment really was. Her message was clear: tone matters. When fans hear constant frustration, constant blame, and constant skepticism about their presence, support erodes. And once that erosion begins, it doesn't matter how strong the on-court product is, because attention doesn't run on principle, it runs on connection. That's why this phase of the story is so critical. Because this wasn't just a dip in numbers, it was a warning. A sign that the league may have misread its own breakthrough moment and underestimated how quickly goodwill can disappear when growth is treated like a problem instead of a gift. And what happened next only made that warning louder. What pushed this situation from uncomfortable to volatile was how the labor conversation played out in public. As negotiations became more visible, the messaging grew harsher. Offers were framed as disrespectful, progress was minimized, and language that might resonate internally landed very differently with the people watching from the outside. Fans who had just started investing emotionally were suddenly being asked to pick sides in a fight they didn't fully understand, and many didn't like the way it sounded. That disconnect mattered. By most reasonable comparisons, the deal being discussed represented real movement: higher maximum salaries, meaningful revenue sharing, tangible investment in facilities, travel, and long-term infrastructure. Compared to where the league had been even a few years earlier, it was a leap forward, but in the public conversation, that context got lost. Instead, the dominant tone was outrage. When people hear numbers that exceed what they'll earn in years described as insulting, it creates friction. Not because fans don't support players, many do, but because relatability evaporates. Support in sports labor disputes depends on trust. Once that trust wobbles, so does public backing. Moments that should have unified fans and players did the opposite. An all-star weekend meant to showcase joy and growth turned flat. Energy dipped, effort was questioned, and what should have been a celebration became another data point for frustration. Shortly after, high-profile moments, boos, tense exchanges, awkward press conferences made the divide impossible to ignore. From there, things spiraled. Fans who had defended the league earlier began stepping back, not out of hostility, but exhaustion. They felt talked down to, blamed, treated like a problem to manage rather than partners in growth. And when fandom starts feeling transactional, people disengage quietly. This is the part many leagues underestimate. You don't lose fans because they're angry. You lose them because they stop caring. The conversation around new projects only reinforced that feeling. Without the primary draw that brought so many people in, engagement lagged. That didn't mean the product lacked quality, it meant the entry point was gone. And without an on-ramp, casual viewers rarely stick around long enough to become loyal ones. None of this was inevitable, but it did follow a pattern. Growth arrives, tone turns defensive, trust erodes, momentum fades. That's how breakthroughs die, not with one bad decision, but with a series of small misreads. And by this point, the league wasn't just facing a numbers problem. It was facing a credibility problem. Which brings everything back to the original moment, the comment that captured a mindset, not just an opinion. Because once fans feel unwanted, rebuilding that bond becomes the hardest job of all. This is where the conversation took a turn that many people didn't expect. Because once the labor numbers started becoming public, the emotional framing began to collide with reality. And when that happens, fans don't just listen, they reassess. As more details leaked out, it became clear that the deal on the table wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a placeholder. By any objective measure, it represented the strongest financial position the league has ever been in. Higher maximum salaries, average pay climbing into ranges that were unthinkable a decade ago, revenue sharing, long-term investment in facilities, travel, and infrastructure that previous generations never had. That context mattered. And it's why voices like Rebecca Lobo stepping in changed the temperature of the conversation. Lobo wasn't dismissing player concerns, but she was pointing out something critical: tone. How a message lands matters just as much as what's being asked for. When players publicly labeled the offer a slap in the face, a lot of fans froze, not because they suddenly sided with ownership, but because the language didn't line up with what they were hearing about the numbers. For many supporters, especially newer ones, it created confusion. If this deal was insulting, what would ever be enough? That question lingered. And once doubt enters the conversation, solidarity weakens. Fans don't like feeling manipulated or guilt-tripped into support. They want honesty, perspective, a sense that everyone understands the bigger picture. Instead, many felt talked down to. That disconnect widened during public moments meant to build unity. Messages that should have rallied fans instead felt combative. Effort during showcase events was scrutinized. Energy didn't match the stakes, and the gap between what fans were being asked to support and what they were seeing started to grow. This is the danger zone for any league. Because public labor battles are rarely won on numbers alone. They're won on trust. Once fans stop trusting the messengers, they stop emotionally investing in the message, no matter how valid parts of it may be. And that's exactly what began happening here. Support didn't flip overnight, it eroded quietly. People stopped defending, stopped engaging, stopped arguing on the league's behalf. They didn't turn hostile, they checked out. That's why this section of the story matters so much. Not because players were wrong to negotiate aggressively, but because the way the fight was framed publicly reshaped how fans felt about their place in the league's future. And once fans start feeling like outsiders instead of partners, momentum doesn't just slow, it slips away. This is the moment where the emotional disconnect finally turned into action. Because fans didn't announce they were leaving, they didn't organize boycotts, they didn't flood timelines with anger, they just stopped showing up. Support doesn't usually disappear in a dramatic way, it fades quietly. Viewership dips a little, engagement slows, conversations move on, and suddenly, what once felt like unstoppable momentum starts feeling fragile. That's exactly what began happening. For many fans, last season was their first real connection to the league. They tuned in because the games felt urgent, because Caitlin Clark made the product feel must-watch. They bought tickets, they followed teams, they invested emotionally, and for a moment, it felt like the league was finally crossing into the mainstream. Then the tone changed. Instead of being welcomed, new fans felt examined. Their reasons for watching were questioned. Their presence was treated like something that needed to be managed. Over time, that wears people down. When fans feel unwanted, or worse, blamed, they disengage. This is where public opinion quietly shifted. Moments that should have unified everyone instead deepened the divide. High-profile events lacked energy. Public confrontations overshadowed the game. Leadership figures were booed. And instead of curiosity and optimism, the dominant feeling became tension. Fans noticed the contrast. They were being asked to support negotiations, campaigns, and messaging that didn't feel aligned with what they were seeing on the court. Effort was scrutinized. Accountability felt one-sided. and the emotional contract between league and audience started to fray. That's when people stopped defending the league instinctively. Not because they suddenly sided with ownership, but because they no longer felt respected in the conversation. Support in sports isn't just about values, it's about relationship. Once that relationship feels adversarial, people step back. And that step back shows up in the numbers. Engagement cooled, national buzz softened. What had been a cultural moment started shrinking back into a niche conversation. The excitement that carried the league through its most visible season in years wasn't gone, but it wasn't protected either. This is the hardest part to reverse. Because fans don't leave when they're angry, they leave when they're tired. Tired of being told they're watching wrong. Tired of being lectured instead of invited. Tired of feeling like enthusiasm comes with conditions. And once that fatigue sets in, rebuilding trust becomes far harder than building hype ever was. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable reality of all, the part no one wanted to say out loud. The league didn't lose momentum because fans didn't care. It lost momentum because fans were made to feel like they shouldn't. That reality became impossible to dodge once the numbers came in. Because when the league's newest off-season venture launched, expectations were high. Unrivaled was promoted as a bold evolution: elite players, primetime windows, national exposure, and a chance to keep momentum alive even without the regular WNBA schedule. On paper, it checked every box. But in practice, something was missing. Despite strong talent and heavy promotion, viewership struggled. Some nationally televised windows posted numbers that raised eyebrows inside media circles. Not because the basketball was bad, but because the audience simply wasn't there in the way it needed to be. And that's when the uncomfortable truth resurfaced. A large portion of the audience that entered women's basketball last season did so through one doorway: Caitlin Clark. When she wasn't part of the product, many casual viewers didn't feel a pull to stay. That doesn't mean other players lack skill, importance, or value. It means star power still matters, especially during a growth phase. That distinction is crucial. Every major sports league has relied on stars to carry momentum. Michael Jordan didn't diminish the NBA, he expanded it. Serena Williams didn't shrink tennis, she globalized it. Star-driven attention isn't unfair, it's foundational. But instead of acknowledging that reality openly, parts of the conversation treated it like an insult. When Unrivaled's numbers lagged, the reaction wasn't introspection, it was defensiveness. Some framed the struggle as a misunderstanding by fans, rather than a signal that the entry point had disappeared, and that framing only widened the gap. Fans don't like being told they're wrong for what they respond to. They respond to stories, personalities, stakes, and when those elements aren't clearly presented, attention drifts elsewhere, especially in a crowded sports calendar. This is why the Unrivaled moment mattered so much. It stripped the conversation down to basics. Talent alone doesn't guarantee engagement. Exposure alone doesn't build loyalty. Growth requires a bridge, and last season, that bridge had a name. Ignoring that doesn't make it go away. It just makes the drop-off sharper when the spotlight moves. Which is why this entire arc circles back to the same lesson. The league didn't lose fans because the basketball declined. It lost them because it misunderstood why they arrived in the first place. And once you lose sight of that, even the best ideas struggle to land. When you step back and look at the full picture, what happened here wasn't complicated, it was human. The WNBA finally had momentum, real momentum, not manufactured hype or polite coverage, but genuine interest driven by emotion, curiosity, and connection. And at the center of that moment was Caitlin Clark, whether people were comfortable admitting it or not. She wasn't the only talented player in the league. She wasn't the only storyline worth following, but she was the entry point, the bridge, The reason millions of people showed up for the first time and decided to stay, at least initially. That's why the response to that growth mattered so much. Instead of protecting the moment, parts of the conversation treated it with suspicion. Instead of welcoming new fans, they were questioned. Instead of leaning into star-driven attention, it was framed as a threat. And instead of using momentum to lift everything else, the league seemed uncomfortable with where that momentum came from. Sports history is unforgiving in this way. Growth doesn't wait for consensus. It doesn't arrive evenly, and it never comes without discomfort. Every league that has broken through has done so because it embraced a star, a rivalry, or a moment that pulled people in faster than the culture could fully adjust. The WNBA was standing in that exact moment. And then it blinked. That's why Rebecca Lobo stepping in mattered so much. Her warnings weren't about choosing sides, they were about awareness, about tone, about understanding that fans are not obstacles to manage, they're partners in growth. Once you make people feel unwelcome, they don't fight back, they leave. And that's what the numbers now reflect. This doesn't mean the league is doomed. It doesn't mean the talent isn't real. And it doesn't mean progress hasn't been made, but it does mean a hard lesson is playing out in real time. Momentum is fragile, trust is fragile, and fans have more options than ever. If there's a takeaway from this entire saga, it's simple. You don't grow a league by questioning why people care. You grow it by giving them more reasons to stay. The WNBA had the world's attention. The question now is whether it learns from this moment or repeats it the next time lightning strikes. Because opportunities like that don't come often. And they don't wait around once they're pushed away. And that's what makes this entire moment so revealing. Because when you zoom out, this story was never really about one update, one rumor, or one trip to Paris. It's about how power works in today's NFL and who actually has it. For years, teams held all the leverage. They dictated timelines. They rushed quarterbacks into bad situations and blamed them when things fell apart. But that balance has been shifting, slowly, quietly, and now it's impossible to ignore. The Cleveland Browns are standing at a crossroads. One path leads to clarity, an intentional hire, a clear offensive vision, and a commitment to patience. The other leads back to the familiar cycle of uncertainty, pressure, and regret. The choice they make will say far more than any press conference ever could. At the same time, Shedeur Sanders isn't chasing the moment. He's letting the moment come to him. That's the part that changes everything. While franchises debate internally, he's building externally. While teams worry about optics, he's focused on alignment. While fans demand answers now, he's comfortable waiting, not out of arrogance, but out of understanding. Understanding that the right situation matters more than the fastest one. And that mindset didn't come out of nowhere. It's learned, it's observed, it's strategic, and it reflects a broader shift in how elite prospects approach the league. They're no longer just evaluating playbooks, they're evaluating people, stability, vision, trust. Which means Cleveland's decision won't just affect next season. It will echo. Other teams will notice how this unfolds. Other quarterbacks will remember who showed patience and who showed panic. And reputations, good or bad, will harden quickly. That's why this moment feels heavier than a normal coaching search. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's quiet, intentional, and incredibly revealing. Soon, the waiting will end, a name will be announced, the speculation will fade, and the story will move from theory to reality. When it does, we'll finally see which side of this equation understood the modern game. The team trying to catch up to the future, or the player who was already there. And that answer will matter long after the headlines disappear.